November 1945, 14:37 local time. A low farmhouse sits outside Market Harborough, Leicester. Rain falls thin and cold, turning the cobbles black and glossy. A Bedford lorry idles in the yard, its breath a white mist in the gray. 23 German women climb down from canvas-covered bunks, legs stiff with travel, faces shrunk by months of salt and sleeplessness. They've been awake since dawn at the transit depot in Hull. Before that, tight decks from occupied Norway. Before that, years of rations, rubble, and the slow unpicking of certainty. A British sergeant in a wet greatcoat waves them toward the door without shouting. He speaks in careful German, gestures gentle as if inviting them into something ordinary. Inside is warmth, an iron range, jars on shelves, a long wooden table laid with mismatched china. Steam rises from a kettle. Loaves, dark and still warm, are sliced thick beside pots of butter and bright strawberry jam. One young woman, mud-caked on her boots, stares as if the scene is a page from a book she can't place. She whispers first, voice barely more than breath, "They call this dinner? If you're here because you want to see how quiet gestures reshaped belief after the war, subscribe now. We're only beginning." November thawed into a brittle afternoon. The lorry door sighed open and a line of women stepped down into light that felt strange for reasons beyond weather. Their boots left damp prints on the yard. Their faces carried the patience of people who had learned to measure loss in small units. A corporal in a sodden greatcoat, salt crust along the collar, hands that had handled rope and ration tins, nodded and said in careful German, "Come inside. Dry off." The phrasing was more courtesy than command, and it unsettled them in a new way. Inside the farmhouse, the air was different, steam from a kettle, the dull warmth of an iron stove, shelves crowded with jars, a long wooden table set with mismatched plates. On that table, a stack of dark loaves waited, still warm. Butter pooled in a dish, jam glinted in glass like small promises. Greta paused under the lintel as if crossing into another life. Her fingers hovered over the crust of a loaf before she dared to touch it. Around her, the other women moved like people relearning gestures, tentative, astonished, careful as if each motion might alter some larger account. They had been schooled in a single story. Years of broadcasts and rumor braided certainty into fear. Capture meant hunger, humiliation, the steady narrowing of dignity. Allied captors were painted as monsters. Survival had been taught as a coin toss. Yet that evening the provisions arrived as routine, not spectacle. A woman in a clean apron smoothed a cloth. A nurse crouched to inspect a palm and in halting German cleaned a wound, wrapped it and said, "This will sting. Hold still." The small courtesy of that kneel, eye-level, gentle touch rang loudly in the room. Small details cut through the grand narratives. The bread was coarse and warm. Butter soaked into its crumb in a way that made bodies startle. Greta tasted a sliver and the sensation lodged like a fact. Annalise, older, knuckled from years at the machines, took deliberate bites, eyes closing as if each chew contained a permission. Not everyone could eat. One woman stepped outside and vomited, the body rejecting abundance as if it were a contradiction. The physical reaction mapped the quieter psychological shock of encountering unanticipated plenty. Policy shaped action, but policy did not itself pour the tea. In the camp office, a sergeant with wire-rimmed spectacles recorded names with a patience that felt almost ceremonial. An interpreter, once a shop clerk in Hamburg, now in British uniform, moved between columns of forms, translating where vocabulary failed. There was no interrogation, only registration. Name, age, former unit, hometown. Each woman received a laminated identity card hung on a lanyard. Small squares of paper and plastic that meant a place in a system that would treat them as people, not only as numbers. That night the mess hall smelled of shepherd's pie, boiled cabbage, fresh carrots. Rice pudding arrived with a spoonful of jam. The food was both ordinary and extraordinary. Women ate slowly, tears sometimes cutting tracks through grime. The loaf on the table became a motif, a civilian object demonstrating that surplus could be routine rather than theatrical. The ordinary meal carried a quiet kind of power, an everyday thing reframed as proof that another arrangement of life was possible. Billets followed, Nissen huts partitioned with wooden boards, bunks made with a mattress, 2 blankets, a pillow, and a footlocker. A handwritten notice in German listed roll call, lights out, rules for letters and medical complaints. Routine more than rhetoric began to steady nerves. That evening, a glossy catalog left behind by a guard made the rounds, pages of appliances and radios, of toys and washing machines, images that looked like invitations to a future the women had been taught to consider impossible. Greta smoothed a page and felt something shift in her chest. The printed prices and smiling households read like a small, dangerous promise. This scene did not erase memory. Annalise had telegrams about victories, ration coupons, and the slow hunger that had thinned her sister until bones showed through work clothes. But the farmhouse loaf reframed a larger question. If the enemy had bread to spare, what else about the story of enmity might be false? Small cracks appeared in the edifice of certainty. Rumor and doctrine, so long fused, began to loosen at the edges. By the end of the first night, the women understood something that would take months to name. The provisions in the attendant manors were instruments of policy and of restraint. They did not absolve the past nor proclaim moral superiority. Instead, they offered something simpler and firmer, a foundation where small daily acts of human repair could begin. Greta slid the catalog page under her pillow and slept with a face that looked less hardened than it had for years. Worn lines softened as if the loaf itself had translated something essential. All around her, small conversations began, about names, about places, about how to mend a seam or sharpen a spade. It was not conversion. It was a reordering. Suspicion loosened into curiosity, contempt thinned into questions. In the months ahead, these casual exchanges, tea passed, tools borrowed, a tune hummed, would prove to be the quiet work of rebuilding trust. Weeks settled into work and the rhythm of small reciprocities. Groups of 8 to 10 were sent to local farms on rotation, harvesting, stacking, mending, supervised by a civilian farmer and a single British guard. The labor was real, seasonal, capped at humane hours. At midday, the farmers' wives brought tea in enamel mugs and thick sandwiches, cheese, pickles, sometimes ham when rations allowed. The women ate sitting on crates with backs pressed to stone walls. Initially, they ate like people who expected food to be temporary, measured bites, wary swallowing. Then the measurement loosened. Conversation slipped into the gaps. Anna, a woman who had run lathes in Hamburg, found herself before a tractor one morning when it stalled. She asked in a low voice if she might look, and the farmer shrugged. "Why not?" he said, and watched as her hands, quick with acquired skill, coaxed the engine back to life. He wiped his palms, brought her a mug of cellar cider later that day, and gave her a nod that meant respect. Anna's hands, black with grease, felt useful again, the tactile, practical agency of someone whose skill translated to value. The camp infirmary was an axis of the moral architecture. Sister Agnes, who had learned her trade during London's worst nights, oversaw fever charts and dressings with steady insistence. A woman named Clara, fevered and thin, hovered 1 week between sleep and delirium. Agnes read aloud from a battered German novel at night and sat by the bedside while the thermometer slowly dropped. Small bites, she told Clara when she could swallow again. To the administrators, medical care was compliance with convention. To those who received it, it was evidence that the machinery of warfare could be redirected toward repair. Suspicion did not disappear overnight. Villagers watched the lorries with eyes that measured loss, sons dead in Normandy, brothers in the skies. A market vendor spat in a woman's path and grumbled an epithet that had been sharpened by grief. Tensions surfaced among prisoners, too. A woman who declared she would apply to remain in Britain was spat upon as a traitor by those who feared retribution at home. Once, a corporal lost his temper and shook a prisoner's arm. The incident was reported. The corporal was disciplined, and the commandant's reprimand, delivered through an interpreter, made it plain that restraint was policy, not optional temperament. The barbed wire remained, a visible limit the administration refused to augment with cruelty. Letters home created quieter revolutions, censored but still legible in private detail. A note that read, "We have bread every day. I do not understand it, but I am grateful," traveled through ruined towns and into kitchen conversations. People read such lines aloud, and the cracks in propaganda widened. A stolen catalog page showing appliances circulated like a forbidden proof that other economies existed. One woman hid a page with a washing machine advertisement under her shift and felt a strange grief for possibilities she had been denied. The recreation hut became a locus of improvisation. A grassroots library took shape out of donated volumes in German and English. Ursula, a former teacher, cut flashcards from scrap paper and taught basic English lessons. A music circle formed, voices, a battered guitar, improvised percussion, and on Sunday nights the women sang in German and English. Guards came and sat at the back, cigarettes between their fingers only partly to keep watch. The applause at the end of a song was polite and oddly real. These were not replacements for the past, but beginnings of small human economies that functioned despite the wire. Work and competence led to trust that yielded material returns. A group finished a job ahead of schedule and silently cleared an adjacent plot. The farmer noted this and brought extra tea and a basket of shortbread the next day. Frida learned to drive a tractor under an elderly farmer's coaching. The first time she managed a full furrow without stalling the engine. He clapped her shoulder and laughed. She volunteered for extra hours and felt pride where there had once been only shame. A signals woman who had once encoded messages now repaired a camp radio. The commandant thanked her personally. The small recognitions reshaped how individuals saw themselves. Not every arc bent the same way. Some women clung to ideology, to the framework that had structured their entire life. Others shifted incrementally. Curiosity, then correspondence, then application to remain. The camp's machinery allowed for variance. Repatriation in late 1946 processed many who chose to return, but some farmers petitioned to keep their workers longer, and a handful of petitions succeeded. The archive would later record numbers, 1-200 processed, low mortality, but records can compress the full range of human negotiation into tidy lines. What mattered day to day were recipe books gifted at farewells, tractors taught and mastered, and the letters folded into pockets on train platforms. Winter hardened the ground and deepened routines. The women mended barns, tended livestock, and carried water through mornings glassed with frost. Small rituals took on a new weight. A nurse's nightly rounds, the ritual of cleaning a bowl, the precise way a farmer wrapped a tart in cloth and slipped it to a worker with a single nod. The Nissen hut smelled of wet wool and paper. Borrowed books circulated, flashcards were quizzed by lamplight, and music drifted like a wound being soothed. The infirmary remained central. Sister Agnes kept meticulous logs and argued on behalf of medicine and blankets. When Clara slid through febrile nights, she read to her until the shiver ceased. These practical intimacies, hand on a fevered brow, a spoon of broth, were not gestures of theory but of care. A doctor's note in the ledger meant a clean bandage at the end of the row. To those who received it, the bandage meant the difference between survival and erasure. Community interactions complicated the narrative of enmity. A boy at market shared a sandwich. A widow tucked an extra slice of bread into a parcel. A farmer pressed a jar of plum jam into a hand and said, "For your mother." Such gestures didn't undo grief, but they reframed it. At the manor kitchen, Mrs. Atwood taught a woman to pare a potato thin and season cabbage with a pinch of nutmeg. She wrapped 2 leftover scones in a napkin and said, "For later." The prisoner whispered thanks and did not expect more. The gesture sat with her like a new grammar of possibility. Tensions surfaced and were met with consequence. A corporal who had a reputation for brusqueness grabbed a woman roughly. The complaint moved up the chain, and he was reassigned to gate duty. The commandant's reprimand made the rule visible. The wire alone sufficed as punishment. Adding humiliation was not the camp's purpose. These corrective moments reinforced the architecture of restraint that ran through policy. Discipline, not cruelty. They also left scars. Small abuses lodged in memory and sometimes re-emerged as suspicion among prisoners. As spring approached, planting began, and with it more chances to prove reliability. Frida, now adept at the tractor's gears, volunteered for extra hours and took pride in furrows straight as a line drawn by intention. The farmer who had taught her watched with an unspoken approval. He had lost a son overseas, but on the field he observed competence and nods of appreciation. Replaced automatic hostility. The human economy, tacit, local, unglorified, continued to build trust brick by small brick. Letters continued to ripple outward. One carefully worded missive, "We have bread. I do not understand, but I am grateful," arrived after 3 weeks in a town where families gathered to read every scrap as evidence. Propaganda had insisted otherwise. The letter introduced a new data point. Envelopes accumulated into debate and doubt. People at kitchen tables who once accepted one set of facts began quietly to ask whether other facts might be true. Some women applied to remain temporarily after repatriation. Farmers petitioned the War Office citing labor shortages. The petitions were utilitarian, not sentimental. Crop yields depended on hands that had proven reliable, but the resulting extensions created unexpected lives. A woman who stayed to help in Mrs. Atwood's kitchen later received a handwritten recipe book as a parting gift. Another Frida used tractor experience to work in a small co-op after returning. These were not dramatic conversions but incremental adjustments to possibility. The music nights in the mess hall continued and grew. A choir sang in 2 languages. The harmonies were sometimes clumsy but always sincere. Guards who had once been watchers sat at the back and clapped. The small sharing of song created a shared moment that ruffled the edges of simple binaries. It did not erase the war, but it made room for human habit. Laughter, applause, the communal need to make and hear sound. Summer edged toward a fullness where choices tightened into destinations. Repatriation lists circulated and trains were scheduled. For many, the question resolved into practicality. Could one return to a city reduced to rubble, to kin scattered like torn pages? Marta, who had kept a folded catalog page tucked in a pocket for months, decided to apply to remain for a year, citing her work skills and the temporary stability of a local farm. She did not romanticize staying. She weighed options and survival. A few women married locally in quiet ceremonies became bakers, seamstresses, or kitchen hands. The farmer who'd taught Frida to drive the tractor wrote a recommendation when she considered a permanent post. She declined for now, but later opened a small bakery back home, writing the farmer occasionally with mundane questions about seeds and seasons. A woman who had pieced together radio circuits at the camp found work repairing appliances in a market town. A former nurse kept the recipe book Mrs. Atwood had given her and fed neighbors in harder winters. These outcomes were pragmatic, new survival strategies sown from the skills learned in the fields and kitchens of England. Not all stories ended in new routes. Many returned to Germany, traveled on trains that carried travel papers and small stipends, and re-entered cities under military administration and scorched skies. They arrived to relatives in ruins, to the difficult work of rebuilding, to ration lines and the bureaucracy of displacement. Some who left carried recipe books, catalog clippings, and letters folded into trunks, evidence of another life lived for a time. Others stayed in Britain and quietly integrated over years, sometimes taking citizenship, sometimes living between identities. Formal repatriation closed the camp files, but memories remained porous. Farewells were small, a handshake, a wrapped scone, a note tucked into a pocket. Farmers stood on platforms watching trains, practical in their sadness. Those who stayed adapted. Those who left made livelihoods from fragments of skills picked up in unexpected places. The archive would later record that mortality had been low, vaccinations administered, rations above calculated thresholds, but those numbers only sketched the outline. The interior histories, menus learned, songs sung, a child given a biscuit at a farmhouse gate, carried the deeper shape of consequences. Decades on, the stories surfaced in interviews, letters, and marginalia in recipe books. A woman who once mended a tractor opened a bakery and signed letters with a small flourish. Another kept a recipe annotated in the margins and taught daughters how to pare potatoes the way Mrs. Atwood had shown her. These domestic traces refracted the larger lesson. Restraint can be a form of strength. Feeding and caring for captives did not make victory hollow. It complicated the moral geography of triumph. The decision to hold to Geneva standards made the post-war world one where some choices could be lived into, not simply inherited. Small acts accumulated. Bread, a mug of tea, the repair of a machine, doing nothing to efface the violence of war, but creating roots for different futures. The farmhouse table that first held a loaf did not become a panacea. It did become starting place, a visible token that human decency could exist within the architecture of power. The women who had been moved across country and circa the wire carried those starting places into lives that were messy, practical, and sometimes hopeful. By the time the war's debris had settled into memory, the farmhouse and the women who'd once stepped across its threshold were long gone. The fields around Market Harborough had returned to their ordinary cycles: plow, seed, harvest, rest. But the story that had begun with a loaf of bread still lingered in the air, like the smell of yeast long after the baking is done. Greta returned to Germany in the autumn of 1947. She stepped off the train into a city she barely recognized, streets split open, roofs like broken ribs, her mother's bakery reduced to a heap of bricks and dust. Yet she still carried, folded deep in her coat, That catalog page from England. The one with the smiling woman and the shining washing machine. She'd kept it not as evidence of luxury, but as proof that other ways of living existed. That piece of paper became her blueprint. She opened a small bakery out of a basement that had once been a coal room, kneading dough with hands that had learned to shape gratitude as much as bread. Annalise stayed in Britain. The farmer who'd taught her how to mend fences offered her steady work, and later a place at his table. She never married, but she never left either. When the farm changed hands decades later, the new owner found her recipe book still on the shelf, flour smudged, its cover marked with her careful handwriting in 2 languages. Frida, the mechanic from Hamburg, never saw England again, but she spoke of it to her children, the way the tractors purred like living things, the way the British farmers nodded instead of shouting, the way the bread was thick and dark and enough. She told them that she learned more about strength from 1 winter of fair treatment than from a decade of slogans. And Sister Agnes, who had once checked pulses by lamplight and read to feverish women until the chill passed, retired in the 1950s and kept a small box of letters, thank you notes written in looping German script. None of them mentioned ideology or guilt. They spoke instead of bread, of blankets, of a nurse who had shown kindness without permission. The documents, the War Office directives, the Red Cross inspection reports, the ration tables, can quantify treatment, but they cannot measure change. The numbers record mortality below 0.5%, caloric intake above civilian average, disciplinary infractions few. But hidden in those statistics were the tremors of something quieter, the unlearning of certainty, the rediscovery of decency. It began with a loaf, and it grew into a pattern. Nurses who knelt instead of scolded, farmers who offered tea instead of suspicion, guards who corrected cruelty instead of excusing it. These were not gestures of charity. They were acts of discipline, the harder kind, the kind that refuses to mirror the enemy's brutality even when vengeance feels justified. When Greta's granddaughter would later open the bakery's worn ledger, she'd find a note written in her grandmother's hand, dated 1958. Bread must always be shared. That is the only rule that matters. She never explained it fully, but anyone who had heard her stories could guess, because by the end of the war, Britain had proven something paradoxical. That restraint could be as powerful as retribution. Feeding your enemy didn't mean forgiving them. It meant insisting that civilization survive its own victory. The British didn't win that war with kindness, they won it with steel, with endurance, with the grinding machinery of empire. But in the aftermath, in how they treated the conquered, they demonstrated something harder than force: moral authority. The German women who passed through those camps carried that lesson quietly into their separate lives. Some told it to their children, some wrote it into memoirs, and some simply lived differently, less sure of what propaganda demanded they believe, more certain of what decency required them to do. The bread became a symbol, not just of sustenance but of continuity, a reminder that humanity could persist even when the world had been taught to forget it. And if you listen closely, you can still hear that moment. The scrape of chair legs on wood, the breath before the first bite, the tremor of disbelief turning slowly into something like hope. If this story reminded you that history's quiet gestures often outlive its loudest victories, then take a moment to remember them. Because sometimes the proof that civilization survived isn't found in the ruins or the medals. It's in the simple act of feeding someone who no longer deserves hunger. If you want more stories like this, of war, mercy, and the fragile moments that shaped what came after, subscribe now to keep them alive.